The night before the German attack began, the steppe was almost silent. The wind barely moved the long grass, and even the distant batteries of the Central Front seemed to hold their breath. It was the early hours of the 5th day of July, 1943, and somewhere along the forward defensive belt west of Prokhorovka, a middle-aged Soviet engineer stood knee-deep in a trench, holding a loop of wire that looked so ordinary it bordered on absurd. The loop was thin, light, almost delicate. It hardly appeared capable of snaring a stray dog, let alone influencing the course of the largest armoured clash in human history. And yet he studied it with the seriousness of a surgeon inspecting a vital organ. His name was Colonel Ivan Fedorovich Starinov, a man who seldom appeared in battlefield memoirs despite shaping large stretches of the war more profoundly than many generals whose stories became legend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His hands, stiff from age and years of frostbite, worked slowly as he checked the tension of the wire loop, then traced the insulated line running back into a buried command box no larger than a bread loaf. Inside that box was a simple firing circuit, sealed against moisture with wax. One small toggle, hidden beneath a metal safety plate, was all that separated the quiet grassland from a mine belt designed to detonate not in scattered bursts, but with orchestrated precision. It was not the explosive power itself that would matter in the coming hours. It was the timing set by wires like this one, wires that snaked through the earth in patterns visible only to the men who had buried them. Above the trench, the field smelled of dry soil and the faint metallic tang of disturbed earth. Somewhere in the distance, the faint rumble of German engines too far to locate, but close. Enough to be felt more than heard rolled across the steppe. Reports arriving earlier that night had estimated the Germans had pulled nearly 3,000 armoured vehicles into position for the long-anticipated offensive, including dozens of the new, heavier Panthers of the 2nd Panzer Corps. If they broke through the first belt by morning, the second before noon, and the third by nightfall, the Red Army's strategic reserve around the rail junctions east of Kursk would be forced to fight from the march. The entire Soviet plan for 1943, shaped by months of intelligence gathering and defensive preparation, would detonate along with the defensive line. That was why Starinov had returned to the front, even though his rank and age no longer required him to step into trenches. He wanted to check the trigger lines with his own hands. He wanted to feel the resistance of the wire, to listen as it vibrated faintly in the cool pre-dawn air. For him, this was not an engineer's abstraction. It was the physical shape of the Red Army's last argument, an argument that had to succeed. The irony, and he was old enough to appreciate it, was that his entire life's work had been based on something the Soviet government had initially considered almost frivolous. In the early 1930s, when he first proposed using interlaced wire loops as the triggering mechanism for controlled demolition belts, critics had dismissed the idea as peasant logic, too simple for modern war. The future, they argued, belonged to heavy industry, armoured vehicles, and long-range artillery. Wire belonged to farms and fences, not the battlefield of the mechanized age, but Starinov had never believed that. He believed in material truth, the kind revealed by detonators, explosive charges, and the predictable geometry of blast patterns. Machines did not win wars unless the ground allowed them to, and the ground could always be shaped. He had spent the first years of the German invasion proving that lesson again and again. Mines placed at choke points near Smolensk had crippled entire armoured columns when retreating. Red Army units were too shattered to mount coordinated defence. Delayed action charges buried under roads in the Donbass had halted the movement of German supply trucks for hours at a time. But nowhere had the lesson been more stark than in 1941, when he oversaw demolitions that slowed the Wehrmacht's advance toward Moscow long enough for fresh troops to form new defensive lines. The West often credited the winter for that reprieve. Starinov knew better. Winter merely froze the ground beneath the debris piles. It did not place those obstacles there. Still, the scale of Kursk was different. Nothing he had conceived before matched the magnitude of the defensive belts prepared here. He had walked the trenches of the Voronezh front during the last week of June and listened as young engineers, some barely 20 years old, described how they had unspooled wires through the night until their fingertips bled. They had buried the interlaced loops in coils, arcs, and branching networks. Some were trip detonators. Others were command circuits leading back to small firing posts. All of them, regardless of complexity, came down to the principle he had refined decades earlier: a wire that, when properly laid, could function as a nervous system for a battlefield. Now, hours before dawn, he looked across the terrain that stretched to the west. The Soviet engineers had not simply laid mines and wire. They had reshaped the land. Anti-tank ditches curved like shallow rivers. Barbed wire entanglements, nearly invisible in the low light, formed tangled curtains between trenches. The wire loops, the ones skeptics had once laughed at, curled through the grass in layered arrays. Starinov knew that the Germans, with their reputation for engineering rigor, would expect mine belts. They would expect anti-tank, obstacles. But they would not expect what he had buried here: a system that allowed hundreds of charges to be fired almost simultaneously by a single command pulse. Not random detonations, not scattered blasts. A sequence, timed and deliberate, capable of triggering landslides of earth and shrapnel. He tightened the safety on the control box, then climbed out of the trench. To the north, he saw faint movement shadows of Soviet infantry settling into firing positions. Most of them had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was wired like a vast, coiled machine. They knew about the mines, of course, but they did not know the precise way these fields could be triggered, nor how the Germans would react when they met resistance that behaved with an almost unnatural coordination. As he stood listening, the first illumination flares arced over the horizon. They drifted slow and weightless, brightening the western sky with harsh white light. The German artillery that followed came in, waves methodical, concentrated, predictable. Starinov watched the pattern of impacts against the first defensive belt and noted, with the faintest sense of satisfaction, how the ground barely shifted. The mines were buried deep enough. The charges were shielded by damp soil. The wires he and his team had laid over the past days remained untouched. He began walking back toward the observation dugout, each step crunching slightly on the dry earth. Behind him, the German barrage intensified. Somewhere far ahead, on the forward slope, anti-tank guns began to fire. Their sharp, metallic cracks carried through the soil. That was the signal he had expected. The German armor was moving. Inside the dugout, the command post was dimly lit by a single shaded lamp. A radio operator sat with headphones pressed against his ears, listening to reports from forward observers. A map of the first defensive belt lay open on the table, marked with pencil lines, dots, and numbered boxes. Each box corresponded to a firing circuit, and each circuit connected back to wire loops identical to the one Starinov had checked minutes earlier. He leaned over the map. How long until they reached the forward mine line? Minutes, the operator replied without looking up. Starinov exhaled slowly. The timing had to be perfect. If the Germans advanced too quickly, they might cross the first mine belt before the command could be sent. If they approached too slowly, the artillery preparation would scatter his sappers before they could withdraw to secondary positions. But as he listened to the deepening roar of engines, he knew they were arriving exactly as anticipated. German doctrine, the very doctrine that had crushed Europe in 1940, operated with a rhythm so predictable it could be prepared for with mathematical precision. He reached for the field telephone. The line connected him to the forward sapper detachments that had retreated into secondary trenches. Their commander answered with a terse acknowledgement. Behind the engineer's voice, Starinov heard the noise of tanks moving over broken earth. "Listen for my signal," Starinov said. "Do not fire early. Do not fire late." The reply was a quiet, steady, "understood." When he set down the receiver, one of the young officers in the dugout asked the question that had been lingering in everyone's mind. "Will they see the wires?" Starinov shook his head. "No, they will see only the ground. That is the point." Outside, the morning light grew stronger, and with it the sound of machinery. The tanks were drawing close now, Panzer IVs, some Panthers, perhaps even heavier vehicles farther behind. Their treads clattered against the soil, the noise rising like approaching thunder. Starinov stepped outside to watch. Across the wide plain, scattered through smoke and dust, dark shapes emerged in formation, armoured silhouettes, advancing in lines so straight they could have been drawn with a tough ruler. Behind them, half-tracks carried grenadiers. Field cars and radio trucks followed at a measured distance. To an untrained observer, the sight might have seemed unstoppable. An armoured wave, precise and relentless, bearing down on the Soviet lines. But Starinov did not see a wave. He saw weight. He saw pressure. He saw the point at which human ambition intersected with the inescapable laws of material resistance. When the first tanks crossed the coordinates marked on his map, he gave the signal. A single engineer in a nearby trench flipped a metal plate, pressed a toggle switch, and closed a circuit. The ground answered. It did not erupt in random plumes. It did not detonate in scattered flashes. It rippled an orchestrated sequence of blasts rolling across the forward slope like a drumline. Dozens of charges fired almost simultaneously, triggered by the wire loops Starinov had buried with such care. Tanks lurched as earth collapsed beneath them. Some slewed sideways, tracks, broken. Others fell into pits where mines had blasted soil away. Smoke columns shot upward in synchronized bursts, creating a barrier of dust so dense that units behind the lead tanks slowed in confusion. Starinov watched without expression. He had seen explosions all his life, but this was different. Here, he saw a line of reasoning made visible, a doctrine he had shaped long before this war, now unfolding across the largest battlefield of the age. The German formation hesitated. One hesitation became two. Then the entire forward column stalled. That moment, those few seconds in which the synchronized blasts tore the geometry out of the German advance, marked the beginning of a 24-hour period in which thousands of German vehicles would fail to break through the first defensive belt. Not because they lacked fuel or ammunition, not because their commanders hesitated, but because wire loops, buried beneath the grass by engineers who had worked through the night, had turned the ground itself against them. And in the quiet that followed the first wave of detonations, Colonel Starinov did something unusual. He allowed himself a single breath of satisfaction. He had been told years earlier that wire could not stop tanks. Now the tanks were stopped. The first minutes after the detonation were defined not by sound but by disorientation. German tank commanders, their viewports smeared with dust and debris, struggled to see beyond the swirling clouds. Radio chatter, normally crisp, clipped, and unmistakably confident, crackled in erratic bursts as platoons tried to report their situation. Some tanks halted abruptly, unsure of what lay ahead. Others attempted to maneuver around disabled vehicles but found themselves slipping into fresh craters or colliding with wrecks half hidden beneath the dust. To the Soviet observers stationed in the secondary trenches, the scene resembled a sudden convulsion passing through what had moments earlier looked like an unstoppable armored advance. Tanks turned at awkward angles. Half-tracks slowed, unsure whether the explosions had been isolated or the beginning of a far larger trap. German infantry, riding on the back decks of the tanks, dismounted hastily and scattered into roadside ditches. None of them yet understood that the blasts had not been random. They were the first pulse of a defensive architecture designed with deliberate, mathematical precision. Inside the observation dugout, Starinov listened as new reports began to arrive. A scout positioned on a ridge north of the sector spoke first. Lead elements are stalled. Some are reversing. Others are searching for a lane. Starinov nodded, though his expression remained neutral. He expected the Germans to attempt exactly that, probing for weaknesses, searching for a seam where they could slip through the defensive line. He had spent years refining techniques to prevent such breakthroughs. The wire loops and command circuits were only part of a layered system. Ahead of the stalled tanks lay irregular mine clusters, anti-tank gun emplacements, concealed infantry, and a second row of command-detonated charges. The entire system functioned like a labyrinth, specifically designed to absorb the momentum of mechanized warfare and convert it into confusion. He stepped outside again just as a gust of wind swept across the battlefield, thinning the dust enough for the advancing units to become visible once more. Now he could see the hesitation plainly. German tank commanders raised their turret hatches and peered out. Officers on motorcycles shouted orders as they drove along the edges of the halted formation. Behind them, fresh waves of armored vehicles waited impatiently, their engines idling in dense formations that made fine targets for artillery. The Germans were caught in an engineer's paradox. They were trained to advance with speed, exploiting breakthroughs as soon as they appeared. But breakthroughs required clarity, clear lanes, clear flanks, clear objectives. The wire-triggered blasts had removed that clarity. They had not destroyed 2,000 vehicles, as the legend would later claim, but they had done something equally consequential. They had interrupted the rhythm of the attack. A momentary loss of rhythm on a battlefield the size of Kursk could cascade into an operational failure. Starinov was keenly aware of this. Rhythm was everything. It defined when charges should be fired, when troops should withdraw, and when the next phase of the defense should begin. He scanned the horizon, calculating the time it would take for the Germans to reorganize. The artillery behind him was quiet for now. Ammunition was limited, and the Soviet commanders were conserving it for the moment when the German infantry advanced far enough to become vulnerable to concentrated fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A runner arrived from the right flank, his uniform dusted with earth. "Comrade Colonel, the second belt team is in position. They request confirmation on the firing order." Starinov walked back into the dugout, tracing the map with his finger. The second belt was not designed to destroy tanks outright. It was intended to channel them to force the armored columns into narrower paths pre-sighted by anti-tank guns and artillery. If the Germans chose the wrong approach, they would be struck from 3 sides at once. "Tell them to hold," he said. "Not yet." The runner saluted and disappeared. Another voice crackled over the radio, this time from an officer located on a small knoll overlooking the central sector. "They are probing with engineers," he reported. "A group has dismounted and is inspecting the ground." So the Germans had realized what had happened. Their pioneer units, well trained and experienced, were assessing the damage. They would soon look for wires, blasting caps, and pressure plates, anything that could reveal the pattern of the mine belt. Starinov respected their skill. In another life, he might have admired it openly, but here, admiration took a different form. It manifested as anticipation. He waited for the next report, and it came quickly. They're bringing up mine-clearing vehicles. Of course they were. The Germans had prepared for every scenario they believed possible. They had brought armoured engineering vehicles, dozer blade tanks, and mine rollers designed to clear pathways through minefields. But they had not prepared for command-detonated belts buried deep enough to avoid premature triggering by surface pressure. They had not prepared for wire loops that required no contact at all, only the signal of a sapper dozens or hundreds of meters away. Starinov leaned over the map again, aligning the reports with the coordinates of the next circuit. "Prepare the second firing. Line," he told the officer beside him. "Stand by for my command." To the officers in the dugout, he appeared calm. To the men digging foxholes outside, he appeared almost distant, as though the explosions and the advancing tanks were familiar to him in a way few other men could claim. They were, in fact, familiar. He had lived among explosives long enough to distinguish their significance not by sight or sound, but by the subtle shifts in the battle's tempo. The tempo shifted again. A sudden burst of tank shells landed near the forward trenches, sending fountains of soil skyward. The German units had reorganized more quickly than expected. Lines of armored vehicles began to push forward once more, this time more cautiously but with renewed determination. The hesitations of the first minutes had evaporated. The Germans had made their calculations, adjusted their formations, and resumed the advance. Starinov stepped outside and watched the tanks creep forward. Their movement was slower now, more deliberate. The drivers were trying to feel the ground beneath them, to sense irregularities that might indicate a mine. Engineers jogged beside them, probing the soil with bayonets and metal rods. Behind them, infantry moved in loose formations, their silhouettes wavering in the heat rising from the tanks' engines. The battlefield had entered its second phase. From the observation dugout, the radio operator called out, "They are approaching the second line." Starinov lifted the handset of the field telephone and held it to his ear. The officer commanding the second belt sapper detachment answered immediately. "We are ready," he said. Starinov watched the advancing tanks, studying the slight changes in their formation. He waited until the first line of mine rollers reached the shallow depression ahead, a depression that looked natural but hid another network of command-detonated charges. The Germans believed they were adapting. They believed the tactics that had carried them across Europe could carry them here. He issued the command. A second wave of explosions tore across the field, this time deeper and more violent than the first. The mine rollers' heavy steel drums designed to absorb blast force were thrown upward like toys. Tanks behind them braked hard, struggling to maintain spacing. Infantry scattered again, but this time there was less cover to dive behind. The ground shook, as if the steppe itself rejected the weight of the armor pressing against it. The plan was working. For the next hours, the Germans tried everything, reforming columns, sending reconnaissance teams forward, shifting their axes of advance, but at every attempt they encountered new obstacles. Wire entanglements they could not see until the last second, mine clusters detonated by hidden command posts, anti-tank ditches reinforced with concealed stakes and explosive charges. Each obstacle required time to evaluate, time to clear, time to bypass. Time was the currency the Soviets needed most, and the Germans were spending it rapidly. By midday, the front-line German units had lost their momentum entirely. What had begun as a coordinated drive had devolved into fragmented assaults. Tanks that attempted to flank the mine belts found themselves funneled into crossfires. Vehicles that tried to advance head-on encountered fresh detonations. Half-tracks stalled behind disabled armor, creating traffic jams that stretched across the fields. Starinov, observing all of this, understood that the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Germans would push forward again. They were relentless and disciplined, but the synchronization of their assault had been broken. And synchronization was the foundation of blitzkrieg. Inside the dugout, a senior Soviet officer finally exhaled and said what several others had been thinking. It appears the line is holding. Starinov's response was quiet. Lines do not hold, men do. He stepped outside once, more. The sun was high now, the heat rising in shimmering waves from the torn earth. Smoke drifted in sheets across the plain, partially obscuring the wrecks of vehicles that had been operational hours earlier. The ground was scarred with craters, trenches, and tangled wire. And yet, behind all of it, the secondary and tertiary belts waited fully intact, fully manned, fully wired. The Germans had not broken through. He lit a cigarette, shielding the match from the wind with his hand. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled as he surveyed the defensive line his doctrines had helped shape. He did not smile. He rarely did. But he allowed himself a moment of quiet recognition. For all the steel, for all the engines, for all the machine power that defined the mechanized age, it was still the simplest tools, wire, explosives, timing that shaped the fate of armies. A runner approached, saluted, and awaited instructions. "Inform command," Starinov said softly, "that the first wave has been repelled." The runner nodded and sprinted off. Starinov took another drag from his cigarette and glanced westward. More German units were forming in the distance, preparing for renewed assaults. The battle for Kursk was far from over. By the end of the day, thousands of vehicles would be committed. The steppe would burn. The air would fill with the roar of engines and the scream of artillery. But for now, for this crucial stretch of hours, the Germans were stalled. Not because of a miracle, not because of weather, not because of luck, but because a network of wire loops, buried beneath the grass by engineers who understood the geometry of destruction, had transformed the battlefield into a vast machine of controlled resistance. The simplest tools had once again dictated the limits of mechanized ambition, and Starinov, standing amid the dust and smoke, knew that history would remember the tanks, it would remember the commanders, it would remember the clash of steel on the steppe, but it would not remember the wires. That was always the way of things. The afternoon heat settled over the battlefield like a heavy blanket, pressing the smoke downward until it clung to the ground in a dense, grey haze. Soviet infantrymen crouched in their trenches, peering through narrow firing slits that offered only blurred glimpses of the German armor regrouping on the far side of the destroyed mine belt. The engine noise had not faded, in fact, it had intensified. More tanks, more half-tracks, fresh waves of infantry climbing down from their carriers and forming into attack groups. The Germans were not retreating. They were reorganizing with the grim efficiency that had made their mechanized doctrine feared across an entire continent. Starinov had expected this. The mine belts and wire-triggered charges were never meant to end the battle. They were meant to shape it. They were the opening movements of a larger composition, one in which every trench, every gun emplacement, and every buried firing circuit had a role to play. He stood once more on the observation ridge, his binoculars resting against the bridge of his nose. The lenses were scratched from years of field use, but they were clear enough to show him the rhythm of the enemy's preparations. He watched as German officers spread maps across tank decks, using their binoculars to trace possible routes through the shattered terrain. He watched the engineers, the pioneers, move cautiously, marking safe paths with white cloth strips. He saw the mine-clearing vehicles inch forward, their crews shielded behind slabs of armor. The Germans had abandoned hopes of a swift breakthrough. They were approaching the first belt as if it were a fortress wall. Far below, the Soviet infantry remained silent. Many of them had been awake for more than a day, passing through cycles of adrenaline and exhaustion, and yet they held their positions. They knew that the integrity of the second and third belts depended on their discipline. One misfired shot could reveal a concealed gun. One premature charge could disrupt the timing on which the entire defense relied. Inside a reinforced bunker beneath the ridge, the Soviet divisional staff gathered around a broad, worn map. Wooden markers indicated the positions of anti-tank guns, artillery batteries, and reserve units. The air inside the bunker was hot and stale, and the distant concussions of artillery shook dust from the ceiling in tiny cascades. A junior officer wiped sweat from his forehead and turned to Starinov. "Comrade Colonel, the Central Front Command reports heavy pressure on the northern sector. They're requesting updated assessments." Starinov leaned over the map, his fingers tracing the lines that represented the German advance. "Tell them the belts are intact," he said quietly. "And tell them the timing remains correct." Another officer glanced up from a field report. "But their reserves," Starinov interrupted with a ported, small, downward wave of his hand. "Reserves matter only if penetration occurs. For now, we control the ground. That is what matters." His certainty settled the room for a moment. Even the staff officers, those who did not fully understand the engineering intricacies, felt the strange calm that emanated from him. Starinov was not a man prone to optimism. The quiet conviction in his voice came not from emotion but from experience, from decades spent studying how battlefields behave under pressure. A messenger entered the bunker, saluted, and delivered a folded note. Starinov opened it without ceremony. The message was short. "Enemy armor massing at grid 14D. Expected movement within minutes." He returned the note to the messenger and stepped outside the bunker. The wind had shifted. Smoke from the earlier explosions drifted eastward, revealing the distant shapes of the German armored columns. Through his binoculars, Starinov counted at least 30 tanks in the forward, group mostly Panzer IVs, some Panthers mixed among them. Behind these came a line of armoured personnel carriers. Behind those, lines of trucks carrying grenadiers. It was a deep formation, one that indicated a renewed attempt to break through in mass. The German artillery opened fire first. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in violent blossoms across the Soviet forward trenches. Earth and debris flew into the air. Men ducked, covered their heads, and waited for the barrage to shift away from them. But the barrage did not shift. It intensified, as though the Germans intended to pulverize the entire line into submission. The ground trembled. Plumes of soil erupted, cascading into the trenches like waves breaking over narrow channels. The artillery was accurate, not perfect, but close enough to cause significant damage if it continued unchecked. Starinov lowered his binoculars and studied the pattern. The Germans were targeting the areas where they believed the mine belts to be weakest. It was a logical approach, one rooted in experience, but experience was not enough to overcome what lay hidden beneath the earth. He returned to the bunker and issued the next sequence of orders. "Prepare firing circuits 3 and 4. Do not activate until my signal." The officers nodded and repeated the command into field telephones. Somewhere along the line, a sapper would lift a safety cover. Another would place his hand on a metal switch. Men whose names history would never record would brace themselves for the instant when their single action might shape the fate of an entire sector. Outside, the German armoured formation began to move. The tanks advanced slowly at first, cautious after the earlier detonations. The mine-clearing teams led the way, probing the ground meticulously. But the Germans had a problem they could not yet see. The safe lanes they were searching for did not exist. The belts had been designed such that even when a path appeared clear, it led to zones pre-sighted by Soviet anti-tank guns. Any attempt to maneuver through these areas would bring them under deadly crossfire. The dusk light began to change. The sun hovered low enough to force the German crews to narrow their viewports, while the smoke drifting across the field made the terrain ahead seem to ripple and distort. The combination of glare and haze created an optical illusion. The ground looked smoother than it was, as if the explosions had cleared the way rather than concealed new dangers. Starinov stood on the ridge, with his binoculars fixed on the lead tank, a Panther. Its broad turret and sloped armor gave it an imposing silhouette. The Panther advanced in short bursts, pausing every few seconds as the crew scanned the terrain for mines. Behind it, the other tanks followed like shadows. "They are committed," Starinov murmured. That was the moment he had been waiting for. He raised the field telephone. "Circuit 3, he said. "Now." The response was immediate. A line of explosions detonated across the shallow depression where the Germans had concentrated their clearing efforts. The blasts erupted not in a line but in a staggered pattern, one designed to destroy mine rollers, disrupt spacing, and force tanks into one another's paths. The Panther at the front absorbed the first explosion beneath its left track. The shockwave lifted the massive vehicle onto its right side, smashing it into the tank following behind. Both machines ground to a halt, blocking the entire lane. Chaos followed. The German formation had been tight, too tight for the confined ground. When the Panthers fell sideways, half-tracks behind them attempted to reverse, but they collided with vehicles farther back. The column rippled with confusion. Engines revved, tracks spun. Metal scraped against metal. Within seconds, the neat column had devolved into a tangle of immobilized vehicles. Starinov spoke again into the receiver. Circuit 4. The second sequence detonated to the south of the first, collapsing the Germans' attempt to bypass the blockage. The explosions heaved earth into the air, forming natural barricades that acted like temporary fortifications. Dust clouds swallowed the advancing units. When they cleared, Starinov saw exactly what he had anticipated. The Germans had been forced into a narrow corridor, one mapped months in advance by Soviet surveyors. "Artillery," he said quietly to the staff officer beside him. "Begin." The order moved like a shockwave through the Soviet lines. Artillery crews scrambled into position. Gunners adjusted their elevation. Range tables were consulted. Within moments, the Soviet guns opened fire first, a few shells, then dozens, then scores. The roar was deafening, a rolling barrage that struck the stalled German formation with brutal precision. Shells rained down onto the trapped vehicles, exploding against armor, crushing wheels, and igniting fuel stores. Infantry caught in. The open were forced to dive into shell holes that only minutes earlier had been the product of German bombardment. The battlefield became a labyrinth of fire and earth, each detonation sending hot debris cascading across the plain. Starinov watched the artillery pattern with the eye of a man who understood not only the destructive force, but the orchestration behind it. The guns were striking exactly where the German formation had concentrated, striking where the command-detonated charges had forced them to cluster. The battlefield had become a funnel, and inside that funnel the Germans were suffering losses they could not afford. Minutes passed, then more. The German advance in this sector had stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Tanks burned in clusters, their ammunition cooking off in violent bursts. Half-tracks lay overturned. Wounded men crawled through the smoke, seeking shelter where none existed. The surviving vehicles tried to reverse out of the kill zone, but the terrain reshaped. by the explosions offered no easy escape. A Soviet officer approached Starinov. "Comrade Colonel," he said, "the division commander sends his compliments." Starinov nodded once. "Tell him the belts have done their work." He turned away from the officer and looked out over the plain. The smoke was rising in long columns now, drifting like ghostly curtains across the battlefield. The light of the setting sun turned everything red soil, smoke, wreckage, giving the scene an unreal, almost painterly quality. But there was no illusion here. This was the work of geometry and discipline, of wire loops strung through the earth by men who understood that even the mightiest armor was helpless when the ground beneath it had been engineered to resist. Behind Starinov, a new runner approached. "Comrade Colonel," he said breathlessly, "Front Command requests an assessment of overall enemy progress." Starinov continued to watch the burning wrecks as he answered. "Tell them," he said quietly, "that in this sector the enemy will not pass before nightfall." And as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting the battlefield into deepening shadow, the truth of those words became evident. The German armoured divisions, so powerful, so meticulously organised, had been halted not by a larger force, nor by superior firepower, but by the buried logic of a defensive system conceived decades earlier by a man who believed that wars were not won by strength alone, but by shaping the ground on which strength must move. And on this ground, on this day, their strength could go no farther. The night settled over the steppe with a quiet that felt almost unnatural after the roar and chaos of the day. Smoke still lingered in low, rolling tendrils, tracing the contours of craters, twisted metal, and abandoned vehicles. The German advance in that sector had been stopped completely, their momentum shattered. Tanks, half-tracks, and trucks lay in silent testimony to the power of preparation, calculation, and timing. For the men in the trenches, the war had been measured not in victories or losses, but in hours in which they had survived while shaping the battlefield itself. Starinov walked slowly among the forward observation points, inspecting the wires and detonators that had caused so much disruption. He knelt to check a loop that had triggered one of the initial sequences, noting its placement and condition. For decades, he had studied explosives and minefields, but this moment was different. Here, engineering had become strategy, and strategy had become psychology. The Germans had moved with the confidence born of doctrine, only to discover that the ground itself could resist them in ways no armor, no training, could anticipate. He thought of the men who had wired the belts, who had crawled through dirt and darkness for weeks, placing explosives and loops with meticulous precision. None of them would be named in history books. Their work was invisible, unsung, yet it had shaped outcomes on a scale few generals ever witnessed. Starinov knew that. He had watched their discipline translate directly into the chaos that now immobilized thousands of enemy vehicles. That was the power of foresight, the human element that even the most advanced tanks could not overcome. The psychological impact on the German forces was already apparent. Soldiers, officers, engineers, they all moved with hesitation now, unsure of where the next hidden charge might lie. Confidence, the lifeblood of blitzkrieg, had been replaced with suspicion, caution, and frustration. Starinov understood that the battlefield was as much about the mind as it was about steel. By forcing hesitation, by controlling the flow of movement, the engineers had achieved a tactical victory far beyond the physical damage inflicted. Behind the front lines, Soviet commanders were assessing the aftermath. Casualty reports from both sides trickled in. While losses were significant among German armor and personnel, the Soviets had preserved the integrity of their line and, crucially, their offensive capacity for the coming days. The wire loops had done more than halt an assault, they had bought time. time for reinforcements, for resupply, for repositioning units along the steppe. In mechanized warfare, time was as precious as fuel or ammunition, and in this instance, it had been purchased with ingenuity, patience, and human labor. Starinov returned to his observation post, taking one final look at the field bathed in the reddish glow of sunset. The twisted hulls of Panther tanks reflected the dying light like dark monuments to overconfidence and the unforgiving logic of terrain engineering. He felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of work done well, of systems executed precisely as intended. He knew that history would remember the battle, the tanks, and the generals, but the wires themselves, the loops and circuits, would remain a hidden victory, a secret of war that few would ever appreciate fully. He thought back to the morning, to the first detonations, to the moment when chaos became control. The German columns had moved confidently, with all the skill and discipline of seasoned troops, only to be halted by what many would consider minor elements. Wires buried beneath the grass, circuits triggered by hidden hands. The lesson was simple yet profound. Even the most technologically advanced forces could be neutralized by foresight, careful planning, and a precise understanding of human behavior. Engineering and psychology, when combined, could bend the battlefield itself to human will. The steppe was silent now, except for the distant murmurs of soldiers cleaning weapons, tending the wounded, and reorganizing positions. Fires from burning vehicles still smoldered, sending streaks of smoke into the twilight. The wind carried the faint metallic scent of spent ammunition and scorched earth. Starinov inhaled deeply, knowing that the calm was temporary. Battles would resume, the war would continue, but tonight, in this small sector of the Eastern Front, human ingenuity had imposed order on chaos, had dictated terms to an enemy who believed only in speed and mass. In the weeks that followed, the Germans would attempt to regroup, reroute, and resume their offensive elsewhere. They would face the same careful preparation, the same methodical execution of defensive principles, and though they would fight valiantly, the lesson would remain. No army, however powerful, could ignore the intelligence, creativity, and discipline of those who understood the battlefield not just as terrain, but as a system of controlled interactions, where the smallest elements could influence outcomes on a massive scale. For Starinov, there would be no parades, no medals, no public recognition. He would continue his work quietly, observing, planning, and ensuring that his knowledge of explosives and engineering remained a decisive advantage for those who understood its application. The men who wired the belts would return to other tasks, invisible in the annals of history, yet critical in the shaping of that day, that battle, and ultimately the larger course of the war. As darkness fell completely, Starinov lit a cigarette. The glow illuminated the worn lines of his face. He watched the last plumes of smoke curl upward from the wrecked German vehicles. Somewhere, deep in the night, the enemy command was assessing losses, calculating how to proceed, and realizing that the ground itself had betrayed them not through chance, but through design. And in that quiet understanding lay a truth that often escaped even the greatest generals. Victory in war was as much about human ingenuity and the control of movement as it was about numbers, guns, or armor. He exhaled slowly, letting the smoke drift across the wind-swept ridge. The battle would continue, but the enemy's confidence had been broken, and in war that was often more valuable than 1,000 tanks. The wires would remain buried, invisible and silent, waiting for the next moment when human foresight and engineering would again dictate the outcome. And history, in its focus on generals and strategies, might never know how close the advance had come to success, and how a few men, armed with nothing but wire, explosives, and discipline, had stopped 2,000 enemy vehicles overnight. In that quiet, Starinov allowed himself the faintest trace of satisfaction. For in war, victories are rarely just won with firepower. Sometimes they are won with thought, patience, and the silent strength of human ingenuity. And tonight, the steppe remembered that truth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.